Theological disillusionment. We must guard against building our faith on intense and unusual spiritual and psychological experiences. Here now is Gene Getz.
The key words in this principle are intense and unusual experiences that are psychological, particularly. And we see this in Elijah. Now let's take a look at 1 Kings 19, beginning with verse 11. Then he said, and this is the Lord now speaking to Elijah. He's in the cave. And by the way, being in that cave is an extension of his depression. He's not out of the woods. He's in this cave at Mount Horeb. Took him 40 days, 40 nights to get there after the nourishment that God gave him, the strength that he gave him. But notice God's not finished. And Elijah has a way to go in his life and his recuperation. Then the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence." At that moment, the Lord passed by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and was shattering cliffs before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. Now that's interesting, isn't it? He saw this incredible storm. But God said, I'm not in the wind. I'm not in that situation. Now, he wasn't saying I'm not in control of that, but he's saying I'm not speaking to you through that storm. And notice, after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Is God in charge of earthquakes? Absolutely. But God was not speaking through an earthquake at that moment. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. Was God in the fire that came down and burned up that altar and the rocks and everything? Absolutely. He was speaking to Israel. But at this moment, he wasn't speaking. He wasn't speaking to Elijah. And notice after the fire, there was a voice, a soft whisper. God was speaking through a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and he went out and he stood at the entrance of the cave. Now again, think about this man's experience over the last 3+ years. Think about what he had experienced. Well, here are some intense and unusual experiences. Let me just quote from the scriptures. Going back to chapter 17. The ravens kept bringing him bread and meat in the morning and in the evening. Wow, that's pretty miraculous. Boy, that would lift you up, wouldn't it? Here come the ravens with the bread and the meat. Look at verse 16 in that chapter. The flour jar did not become empty and the oil jug did not run dry. That's pretty dramatic. That happened maybe for a couple of years. Think about that. God is speaking through that by saying, Lord, I'm here. Or Elijah, I'm here. I'm with you. I'm going to take care of you and the widow and her son. Look at verse 22 of 17. So the Lord listened to Elijah's voice, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. You talk about an intense experience where God is revealing himself, where God is speaking. And then the culmination. Then Yahweh's fire fell and consumed the burnt offering. When Elijah came out of that cave, there was a fire. But God was not in the fire. But he sure was in the fire on Mount Carmel. The wood, the stones, the dust, it licked up the water that was in the trench. Was God in that fire and was he speaking through that fire? You better believe it. But not now. It's just a quiet whisper. And notice 1845. In a little while, the sky grew dark with clouds and the wind, and there was a downpour. And that was after Elijah had prayed 7 times. And all of a sudden, whoa, the sky opened after 3.5 years. Now that was intense. And notice in verses 46 of chapter 18, the power of the Lord was on Elijah. He tucked his mantle under his belt. He ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel, and that was a distance of about 20 miles in a blinding rainstorm, after having taken the life of all those prophets of Baal and gone through all of that intense emotion. God was speaking. But you see, alone there in that cave at Mount Horeb, and it was where God had revealed the law to Moses. And you know how God revealed the law to Moses? He revealed it through a shaking mountain, through fire. He had revealed it through wind and thunder. It was an incredible revelation of who God is. God was in that when He spoke. But at this moment, God was speaking through a still, small whisper. You see, all of these experiences that Elijah had were exceptional. And he had come to depend on the exceptional. And God is saying, the normal way I speak is a soft whisper. We might even say that the normal is often silence. Do you realize that in all of history, there are only 3 major times that God spoke through incredible, miraculous activity? And all of that totals about 150 years out of all history. It was at Mount Sinai. It was on Mount Carmel with Elijah. And in a sense, it was on the Mount of Transfiguration where God revealed Himself, which was symbolic of Jesus' life on this earth and the miraculous way in which He worked miracles for 3.5 years. You see, the normal is silence. Yes, God is speaking, but not through the dramatic. And there are a lot of people who come to rely upon the dramatic. And that's why they have theological disillusionment. In this particular situation, as we look at this, we see Jesus and the exceptional. He turned water to wine. He healed the sick. He multiplied the loaves, the fishes. He walked on the water, raised the dead, and many other experiences. Yes, there was the supernatural. There was, as it were, Mount Carmel or Mount Uriah or Mount Moriah, I should say. Those things were there. They were supernatural. And the apostles, following the time that Jesus went back to heaven for a period of time, we see the signs of an apostle. 2 Corinthians 12:12, the signs of an apostle were performed with great endurance among you. Not only signs, but also wonders and miracles. But that wasn't the normal. It's interesting that Jesus said to Thomas, John 20:29. Notice what Jesus said. Jesus said, because you have seen me, you have believed. And He had put His hands into the side of the resurrected Christ, into the wounds in His hands. He appeared through a door that was locked. And Thomas fell on his face and said, Lord and my God. And Jesus said, because you have seen me, you've believed. Those who believe without seeing are blessed. And that's most of us for 2,000 years. Since Jesus Christ revealed Himself in that incredible, miraculous way. Does that mean God can't work miracles and doesn't? God can work miracles anytime. But that's not the normal. And you see, there are a lot of people who need to learn that God is in the still, small voice. And Elijah had come to depend on all of this experience. And because it didn't happen anymore, as he was walking in the desert, alone in a cave, God just comes with all these manifestations. And He said, Elijah, I want you to see this. but I'm not in that wind. I'm not in that storm. I'm not in that earthquake. I'm not in that fire. He wasn't saying I didn't create it. He said, I'm not speaking through it. I'm speaking to you in a very small whisper. I exist. And your faith should not be dependent on all that miraculous stuff that happened in your life. You need to learn to live with the normal experiences of life. You know, I taught a course in theological and psychological integration. I was up at Word of Life Island where I was teaching counselors one summer way up in upper state New York. And I was explaining to these counselors how the autonomic nervous system works. And those of you who have studied physiology and psychology know that the autonomic nervous system has two basic parts. That's the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. And the parasympathetic system is what is operative when we're sort of relaxed. But the sympathetic system comes into existence when we face a crisis. Depending on the crisis, depends on the amount of adrenaline that flows into our bloodstream. And when we're in an extensive crisis and we go through these tremendous experiences emotionally, what happens is that the adrenal glands are pumping adrenaline into our bloodstream. And what happens is that we gain unbelievable strength. There are people that have been able to lift a car off of somebody in the time of a crisis. They go back and try to lift it, they can't budge it. Where did that strength come from? Adrenaline. Now think about Elijah and the adrenaline in his humanness that he'd experienced on Mount Sinai or on Mount Carmel. Imagine all of that drama. That's one reason why he was physically and psychologically exhausted. Because what happens is after that adrenaline flows in, over a period of time, you get to a place where it's absolutely drained and you drop off the edge of the cliff. And if you have one after another shot of adrenaline, it's worse. And you need to get back to the normal aspects of life. And so that helps explain, I was telling them, I said that helps explain why people in an emotional healing meeting will jump out of a wheelchair and walk for 2 days. Because adrenaline will last for 2 or 3 days. And then they're back. Does that mean that God can't heal? No, but it explains a lot of phenomena that appears as healing, that is not. I was explaining that. That's why people throw away their crutches for 2 or 3 days. They've not been healed. They've had a shot of adrenaline in their experience. And so I was explaining this. And I wasn't saying God can't heal. But there was a young girl that heard that. And she was her theology was based on all this phenomena. And when I explained this, she just came apart at the seams. Because her faith was built on those supernatural, what she felt, experiences. And what she needed to learn is the still small voice. And so I explained this to her and helped to reestablish her faith. You have to be very careful with some of those illustrations, by the way, because people accuse you don't believe God can do miracles. Well, He can anytime He wants. But the fact of the matter is, there are some people who really manipulate that in the lives of people, or they're confused theologically. So remember this principle in our lives as we come to the conclusion of this. We must guard against building our faith on intense and unusual spiritual and psychological experiences. And Elijah needed to learn that lesson.